أهلا بكم طلاب مرحلة ثانية طب القادسية Neurophysiology Video clip number 7 about functions of brainstem nuclei in controlling subconscious and stereotypes movements. A baby is born without brain structures above mesencephalic region ما نسميه بالانسيفالي. Some have been kept alive for many months. ممكن يعيشون لعدة أشهر. Able to perform some stereotype movements بعض الحركات المتكررة التكرارية مثلا for feeding, sucking, extrusions يعني إخراج المواد من الفم of unpleasant food from mouth, moving hands to the mouth to suck fingers. They can yawn and stretch ممكن يتمطى أو يتثاءب. They can cry and follow objects يتبع الأشياء بعيونه أو براسه ممكن يدير عينه أو يدير راسه. Also placing pressure on the upper anterior part of the leg causes them to pull to the sitting position يعني يصير رد فعل في lower limbs باتجاه الأبدومين flexion نسميه. Now the contributions of the cerebellum and basal ganglia to overall motor control. هذا بشكل عام وصف عام لوظيفة البيزل ganglia and cerebellum. Cerebellum plays roles in timing of motor activities, rapid smooth progression from one muscle movement to the next, control intensity of muscle contraction when the load changes, controlling necessary instantaneous interplay between agonist and antagonist muscle groups. About basal ganglia, plan and control complex patterns of muscle movement, control relative intensities of separate movements, directions of movements, sequencing of multiple successive and parallel movements for achieving specific complicated motor goals. Neuronal circuits of cerebellum, the afferent pathway from other parts of the brain. الافرنت يعني الواردة باتجاه السيربيلم. مثال على ذلك corticopontocerebellar which originates in the cerebral motor and the premotor cortices and also in the somatosensory cortex pass to the lateral division of cerebellar hemispheres on the opposite side of the brain. Important afferent tracts. التراكتس اكو afferent tracts وبعدين راح ناخذ afferent fiber type. afferent tracts بالاسم tract olivocerebellar tract vestibulocerebellar fiber or tract هذا اسم لي tract يعني حزمة كاملة. reticulocerebellar fibers or tract حتى ما نخلط مع الفايبرز اللي راح ناخذها بعد شوية. Olivocerebellar tract passes from inferior olive to all parts of the cerebellum يعني تنتشر. Excited in the olive. الأوليف هو مكان موجود بالميدولا oblongata by fibers from cerebral motor cortex, basal ganglia, widespread reticular function and spinal cord. Vestibulocerebellar tracts, some originate in vestibular apparatus and other from brainstem vestibular nuclei. All of these terminate in the flocculo-nodular lobe and fastigial nucleus of the cerebellum. Number 4, reticulocerebellar fibers originate in different portions of brainstem reticular formation and terminate in the midline cerebellar area ما نسميه بالبرمس. Outputs signals usually from the deep cerebellar nuclei. Now deep cerebellar nuclei and afferent pathways. بالأسماء dentate, interposed هي بالحقيقة nuclei and fastigial. all the input signals that enter cerebellum eventually end in the deep nuclei in form of initial excitatory signals وبعدين خلال أجزاء من الثانية تجيها inhibitory signals. From the deep nuclei, output signals leave the cerebellum and are distributed to other parts of the brain. تتوزع إلى باقي أجزاء الدماغ عن طريق الديب cerebellary nuclei, which are the main efferent الصادرة اللي تصدر عن الcerebellum باتجاه other parts of the brain. Now, efferent pathways leading out of the cerebellum. A pathway originates in the midline structures اللي نسميه vermis, pass through fastigial nucleus to the medullary and pontine regions of brainstem. And this circuit functions in close association with equilibrium apparatus and brainstem vestibular nuclei to control equilibrium, and in association with reticular formation to control postural attitude of the body. And number 2, pathway originates in the intermediate zone of the cerebellar hemisphere, pass through interposed nucleus to other part of thalamus, ventrolateral and ventroanterior nuclei of the thalamus, then to the cerebral cortex, and then to midline structures of the thalamus, then to basal ganglia, وأخيرا إلى radionucleus and reticular formation. This complex circuit بخطواتها وتعقيدها helps to coordinate reciprocal يعني رجوعي يعني ذهابا وإيابا contractions of agonist and antagonist muscle in the peripheral portions of the limbs, خاصة hands, fingers and thumbs. Number 3 of the efferent pathways. Pathway begins in the cerebellar cortex of the lateral zone of the cerebellar hemisphere, then to the dentate, and then to the ventrolateral and ventroanterior nuclei of the thalamus and cerebral cortex. This pathway helps an important role in helping coordination. أهم نقطة نعرف الوظيفة مالته، نعرف المنشأ مالته والوظيفة. قد تكون التفاصيل ممكن تنسي طبعا، ولكن لازم نعرف أنه المنشأ مالته lateral cerebellar hemisphere مرورا بالدنتيت. هذا المهم لازم نحفظه. الوظيفة مالته role in helping coordinating sequential motor activities initiated by the cerebral cortex. هذه الصورة توضح لنا principal efferent tracts from the cerebellum. هذه مكان الدنتيت، هذه other tracts، وهكذا many tracts radionucleus اللي ذكرناها midbrain. Now, neuronal circuit of the functional unit. The output مثل ما قلنا is from the deep nuclear cells. This cell is continually under both excitatory and inhibitory influences. The excitatory influence arises from direct connections with afferent fibers that enter cerebellum from brain to the periphery, while inhibitory influences entirely from what is called Purkinje cell in the cortex of the cerebellum. The afferent inputs مثل ما قلنا قبل شوية اكو afferent pathways. Afferent input fibers, two type of fibers, climbing fibers and mossy fibers. Climbing fibers originate from the inferior olive of the medulla. Climbing يعني المتسلقة، باعتبار الانفيريور olive بالمدلة مكانه في الأسفل، فيحتاج الفايبر إلى الصعود للأعلى وصولا إلى السيربيلم. هاي نسميها climbing fibers. One climbing fiber for about 5 to 10 Purkinje cells. After sending branches to several deep nuclear cells, The climbing fiber continues to outer layer of the cerebellar cortex, where it makes about 300 synapses with soma and dendrite of each Purkinje cell. مع كل cell واحدة من Purkinje. Single impulse in it will cause a single prolonged up to 1 second. prolonged نقصد up to 1 second يعني 1000 millisecond peculiar type of action potential in each Purkinje cell, beginning with a strong spike and followed by a trail. strong spike بمعنى بهذا الشكل، trail يعني بهاي الطريقة، weakening يبدأ ثم يضعف، secondary spikes. This action potential is called complex spike، معقدة لأنها ما تتكون من contraction وينتهي، وإنما contraction متبوع ب contractions أقل منها وأضعف. Most C fibers, all the fibers that enter cerebellum from multiple sources مثل brain or brainstem and spinal cord, send collaterals to excite deep nuclear cells. Then they proceed to granular cell layer of the cortex, where they to synapse with hundreds to thousands of granule cells. Granule cells send very small axons less than 1 micrometer in diameter up to the molecular layer on outer surface of the cerebellum. There are many millions of these parallel nerve fibers because there are some 500 to 1000 granule cells for every 1 Purkinje cells. Into this molecular layer, the dendrites of Purkinje cells project, and 80,000 to 200,000 of parallel fiber synapse with each Purkinje cell. Most fibers input to Purkinje cell is quite different from climbing fibers input because their synaptic connections are weak, so that large numbers of MOSI fibers must be stimulated simultaneously to excite Purkinje cell. Activation usually takes form of weak, short duration action potential in the Purkinje cell نسميه simple spike، بينما بالclimbing fibers سمينا prolonged complex action potential. Now Purkinje cell and deep nuclear cells fire continuously باستمرار اكو action بالnormal resting conditions. The Purkinje cell fiber at about 50 to 100 action potential per second. Deep cerebellar nuclei higher rates than this number. There is balance between excitation and inhibition at the deep nuclear cells. Direct stimulation of deep nuclear cells by both climbing and MOSI fiber excite them. يعني climbing and MOSI هن excitatory, while the signals arriving from Purkinje cell are inhibitory to the deep nuclear cells. Normally there is balance between the two effects, but in favor of excitation. يعني excitation هو الأوضح وهو السائد. In execution of a rapid motor movement, there is first a rapid excitatory signal sent by deep nuclear cells into motor output pathway to enhance motor movement, but this is followed within another small fraction of a second by an inhibitory signal مثل ما قلنا. That is, when the motor system is excited, a negative feedback signal occurs after a short delay to stop the muscle movement from overshooting its mark. حتى تمنع الأوفرشوتينج، لأن السيربلر ديسفانكشن راح نشوف بعدين أنه يتبع ما يسمى بالأوفرشوتينج إذا صار عندنا باثولوجي بالسيربلم، وإلا إذا ما صار هذا البالانس راح يحصل عندنا اوسيليشن، يعني حركة تكرارية، ارتداد بهاي الطريقة، اهتزاز of the movement would occur. Other inhibitory cells in the cerebellum, in addition to deep nuclear cells, granule cells and Purkinje cells, two other types نسميها basket cells and distillate cells. They are inhibitory cells with short axons and both of them located in the molecular layer of the cerebellar cortex, among and stimulated by small parallel fibers. These cells in turn send their axons at right angles across the parallel fibers and cause lateral inhibition. نفس القاعدة القديمة اللي شفناها بالspinal cord. Lateral inhibition of adjacent Purkinje cells, thus sharpening signals. نفس الفكرة. Now, functions of cerebellum in overall motor functions، يعني اكو تقسيمات نسميها physiological classification of the cerebellum. Number 1, vestibulocerebellum consists of the folliculonodular lobes and adjacent portions of the vermis، مسؤولة عن البادي equilibrium movements، عن التوازن، حالات التوازن أثناء الوقوف أو أثناء المشي. Vestibulocerebellum. Number 2, spinocerebellum consists of most of the vermis of the posterior and anterior cerebellum plus adjacent intermediate zones, and provides circuitry for coordinating movements of distal portions of the limbs, hands and fingers. Cerebrocerebellum, large lateral zones lateral to the intermediate zone of the cerebellum, receive all its input from cerebral motor cortex and adjacent premotor and somatosensory cortices. It transmits its output information back to the brain, functioning in a feedback manner with the cerebral cortical sensory motor system to plan sequential voluntary body and limb movements. مسؤول عن sequence of the voluntary movement. Now, clinical abnormalities of the cerebellum. Several months after one half of lateral cerebellar cortex on one side of brain has been removed، بعد عدة أشهر if the deep cerebellar nuclei are not removed، يعني إذا بقت طبيعية ما انصابت، the motor functions appear to be normal as long as the person performs movement slowly. The remaining portions of the motor control system are capable of compensation. ممكن تعوض إذا بقت الديب cerebellar nuclei، يعني إذا فقط صارت إصابة بالcerebellar cortex ما وصلت إلى الديب cerebellar nuclei، وإذا الموفمنت slow. To cause serious and continuing dysfunction of the cerebellum اللي عادة نشوفها بالمرضى، the lesion must involve one or more of the deep cerebellar nuclei. Number 1, dysmenorrhea and ataxia. Movements overshoot their intended mark، يعني تعبر الوجهة المقصودة بهالطريقة هذه، تعبر الوجهة المقصودة. Then the conscious portion of brain overcompensates in opposite direction for the succeeding compensatory movements. This effect is called dysmenorrhea، يعني عدم القابلية على حساب المسافات. It results in uncoordinated movements that are called ataxia، حركة غير منتظمة. Dysmenorrhea and ataxia also may result from lesion of spinocerebellar tracts، يعني مو فقط cerebellum. Past pointing. A person moves the hand or some other moving part of the body beyond the point of intention. من نريد نوصل إلى نقطة معينة، من نتحرك باتجاه نقطة معينة قد نتجاوزها بسبب cerebellar dysfunction. Failure of progression نسميه dysdiadochokinesia. Dysdiadochokinesia. Motor control system fails to predict where the different parts of the body will be at a given time. ما يقدر يحدد الموتور سيستم أجزاء الجسم في لحظة معينة وين راح تكون بالsupination، بالpronation، بالflexion، بالextension. Succeeding movements may begin much too early or too late so that no orderly progression of movements can occur. Patient rapidly loses all perception of the instantaneous position of the hand during any portion of the movement. A series of stalled, attempted but jumbled movements occurs instead of the normal coordinated, just like this. حركة بهذه الطريقة المريض قد يسويها بطريقة مرتبكة أو غير منتظمة. And thank you for listening. To be continued.